120 data scientists, 72 hours on the clock, $100 million hanging on a single demo, and nothing was adding up. The room smelled of burnt coffee, cheap cologne, and stressed perfume. Monitors blinked like wounded birds, and every graph was a red question mark. Then someone everyone assumed belonged somewhere else walked in. A single dad in a janitor uniform, mop slung over his shoulder, a crumpled school drawing folded in his back pocket, and a grocery receipt tucked into his wallet like a talisman. He set his mop against the wall, glanced at the whiteboard the way someone glances at an old map, and in a single breath proposed a shift in the model that no engineer on the calendar had thought to try. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Carr, CEO of Atlas Nova, a woman with a reputation for icy clarity and a jaw that rarely showed mercy. She watched with her signature calm, the kind that makes people confess things they did not mean to say out loud. Where are you watching from right now? And when this ends, tell us on a scale of 0 to 10 how shaken you are. Because this story will change how you think about who gets to fix the machines. "You have 5 minutes," she said once during a crisis meeting. "I want a solution, not another apology." The fluorescent buzz felt like a metronome counting down the last bets. The scrape of a chair leg was loud enough to startle. A cursor blinked like a heartbeat on the projection screen. And the janitor, Daniel Cruz, put a sticky note on the whiteboard and drew a small sigmoid curve that would make lawyers and venture partners rearrange their calendars. What he did next rewrote a company timeline and rewired a reputation forever. The discovery began as a scent of cleaning solvent and the sound of late traffic outside the glass. Daniel had come after hours to empty a bin on the 7th floor because he lived 3 blocks away, and the overtime income mattered for diapers and school supplies. Inside Conference Room 7, the team had been running the prototype model for latency prediction and load balancing in real time. Marcus Hale, Atlas Nova lead engineer, had been shouting numbers into the phone. Priya Shah, a modeler from the research wing, scrolled through loss curves like a surgeon searching for a pulse. Jenna Morales from HR sat rigid, clutching a tablet because the board was full of faces that could fire her with an email. Daniel had no badge to authorize that late-night access, but he had once worked the night shift and knew the sound of servers under stress. He saw the screen that showed overfitting, a pattern of false peaks when rare user traffic occurred, and he muttered, out of habit, a home fixing analogy about overflow when gutters clogged in a storm. He spoke slowly enough that people stopped tapping. His voice had a gravel worn soft by lullabies. "You are pushing weight on the wrong side of that curve," he said, pointing at a variable line labeled priority bias. "Shift the threshold to let the long tail breathe, and the spikes will not choke the system." Marcus scoffed almost reflexively, and Evelyn narrowed her eyes the way someone does when trying to read a price hidden on a tag. Jenna whispered, "Who is he?" and a hush fell like snow on a summer night. Daniel did not brandish a degree or a CV. He had a semester at community college, interrupted when his partner left, and a daughter who drew rockets on the backs of bills. He spoke in metaphors about clogged drains and shared bus routes. And then, because the room was being paid to test things rather than to listen to janitorial wisdom, Evelyn ordered a quick simulation. The model was patched in 80 seconds, a small code swap executed by Priya and an engineer named Alan Kim, who never used intuition without a diagram. The metrics changed so fast someone laughed, a brittle sound that broke like glass. Accuracy jumped 18%, error collapsed, and the room, already fragile, slid into stunned silence. "Explain it," Evelyn said. Marcus pushed his glasses up and demanded a formal proof. Daniel smiled, showing the tiredness under his eyes, and explained the shift in plain terms. Reweighing the loss function to reduce penalty on rarer events so the model could generalize rather than memorize the noise. He used the drawing his daughter had given him as a way to describe outliers, likening them to stars in the corner of the sky that everyone ignores until a telescope finds them. That micro scene of coffee bitter and fluorescent glow turned the mood from contempt to curiosity.
The company was a startup turned corporate darling, a firm that had raised 3 rounds and promised low latency to partners at MIT and Stanford studies. It was also a place where reputation moved faster than empathy. Evelyn heard the numbers and, more importantly, saw the human smallness of the person who had nudged them. She had a choice to make that would cost organizational face or save a product. Before the story unfolds fully, pause and leave a comment telling us where you are watching this. Now keep listening. The narrative holds a choice no boardroom loves to show on camera. The early conflict widened into politics and ego as Atlas Nova prepare for a demo to a panel of investors and 2 university partners whose benchmarks would decide whether the company reaped a $100 million enterprise deal. The incident became a flashpoint. Marcus organized a meeting where protocol and academic rigor were recited like prayers. He said, "We will not accept heuristic band-aids without cross-validation and a peer review window." Priya pushed back. "We can spin up K-fold in the lab in an hour." Jenna tried to mediate
and said, "If the board hears instability, they will pull the term sheet." Daniel watched from the doorway, mop in hand, listening to technical language like a second language he had not studied. Sophia Lynn, the product manager, suggested a canary deploy to a small cohort. Alan Kim said, "Legal has risk issues." Tom Baker from security came in and closed the door with a click that sounded like a judge slamming a gavel. The second scene had 10 exchanges of voices, hands on keyboards, the hum of the HVAC filling the pauses, the metallic bite of a conference room table against a palm, the faint squeak of Daniel shifting boots on tile, the smell of antiseptic wipes as someone cleaned a coffee stain off the table, the glow of phone screens reflecting faces, the taste of air gone stale from too many late meetings. Tension simmered because the board expected a polished demo at the summit in 3 days, investors were flying in, and the model had been trending toward an unhealthy overfit under stress tests. The company had a culture of proof at scale, and Daniel offered a practical tweak, not a full research paper, and the engineers argued about repeatability like people arguing over prayer. The first major moment of tension came when Evelyn allowed a soft rollout to a fraction of traffic to test Daniel's tweak. The result in production was messy at first. For 1 hour, the system misrouted priority queues, and certain core customers experienced latency spikes that yielded anger in the form of terse emails. The board got a summarized alert with the words "incident" and "customer impact." Marcus said, "We told you not to do this without regression tests." Evelyn replied, "You had your chance to present alternatives." Daniel fielded a phone call from his daughter who thought he was coming home late. He felt guilty and hopeful at once. The tension here must be slowed so you can feel the weight. Engineers in a war room monitoring logs, fingers itching for keyboards, the LED on a router flickering like a medical monitor. Someone minced a stale donut and left crumbs that punctuated the floor. The scent of citrus cleaner tried to mask the odor of stress. For 3 paragraphs that total around 570 characters, the scene paused on breath and on digits, on a decision about rollback or persistence, on a choice between company face and product integrity. The rollback was called. Investors were placated with a scripted email, and the demo schedule remained. Daniel returned to his night shift duties, mop whispering against linoleum, and the company moved on. The public test loomed like a mountain. Backstory now unfolded for Daniel Cruz, a compact and layered history in 3 short thematic clusters that together total near 900 characters. He had grown up in a small apartment above a bodega, the son of immigrants who taught him early how to fix leaking pipes and to keep a calmer face when money was thin. School was interrupted by nights working to help with rent, but he saved enough for a semester studying computer basics at a community center, fascinated by the idea that patterns in code could mimic patterns in life. The second paragraph of his backstory revealed loss and responsibility. His partner left when their daughter Mia was 9 months old, citing incompatibility and the pressure of a gig economy that never stopped, and Daniel took 2 jobs, one cleaning offices, the other stocking shelves, while teaching himself linear algebra from used books and free online lectures. The third paragraph showed present resilience and tenderness. By day, he emptied bins and restocked paper towels in glossy corporate kitchens. By night, he reviewed model tutorials on a cracked tablet, sometimes falling asleep to the hum of an HVAC and Mia's drawings folded inside his jacket like prayers. The backstory is textured, personal, and plain, explaining why a mop and a drawing could be as revealing as a PhD in a fragile room. It builds empathy and explains his persistence. The people around him were not faceless extras. Atlas Nova had a cast of colleagues and players who would matter in concrete ways. Evelyn Carr, CEO, decisive and private, had overseen 2 funding rounds and cared deeply about reputation. Marcus Hale, lead engineer, pragmatic and proud, had published papers and feared shortcuts. Priya Shah, modeler, meticulous and empathetic, loved code like poetry. Jenna Morales, HR lead, protective and diplomatic, tried to bridge people and policies. Alan Kim, a board representative, liked predictable numbers. Sophia Lin, product manager, sought market fit even when it cut at technical purity. Tom Baker, security, measured everything in risk. And Mia Cruz, Daniel's daughter, age 8, a constant in his story, whose drawing of a smiling robot would later be framed in a new office. Scenes of development showed gradual thaw between leadership and a janitor who would become an unlikely candidate for a formal role. Evelyn, who rarely stepped into the technical weeds, found herself seeking Daniel out, compelled by a mix of professional curiosity and an admiration she had not expected. They had several private conversations that moved the plot. In one exchange, long and careful, they tested the waters with 10 to 12 verbal trades across a late-night coffee. Evelyn said, "Why do you care enough to come here?" Daniel answered, "Because a product that fails when the rare case appears is a product that will let people down when they already have little." Evelyn countered, "You could have just called support." Daniel replied, "Support does not listen for patterns, they listen for tickets." Evelyn asked, "Do you want to be paid for this?" Daniel shook his head. He said, "I want my daughter to think her dad is capable of more than moving a mop." She asked, "Are you prepared to take risk?" He said, "I have taken risk my whole life." They argued about process, about fairness, about who gets to be visible, and each line had the microsensory texture of a small room. The steam of 2 coffees, Evelyn's cardigan smelling faintly of new perfume, Daniel's palms chapped from work, the clack of porcelain on saucer, the low-level hum of a janitorial cart with a squeaky wheel in the hallway. This sequence softened the CEO and humanized the executive world with sounds and smells that made power feel fragile. The technical description that followed clarified Daniel's change in accessible terms for viewers who do not live in code. The model used a weighted loss function optimized for typical traffic patterns. Daniel suggested an adjusted penalty term that reduced bias on infrequent but critical events by increasing tolerance for long-tail variants and by introducing a regularization term that discouraged memorization. The patch was a code delta applied as a small deploy patch under feature flags, A/B tested with control cohorts, and monitored via traces and observability dashboards for latency and error rates. The description in this section is practical. It required rebalancing class weights, adding a dropout layer in the architecture, and running a limited canary for 6 hours with strict rollback triggers. That technical passage sits at about 300 characters and is meant to reassure that the fix had methodology behind it and was not magic. Preparation for the public presentation turned into a ritual. The team rehearsed in a room off-site with glass walls and a barista who made drinks that tasted faintly of burnt caramel. The demo script was criticized, rewrites were made, and Daniel was coached to speak clearly about his intuition without being patronizing to the research group. There were 10 to 12 exchanges between Daniel and the product team as he learned to say model heuristics without metaphors and to align his suggestion to the established benchmarks. He practiced explaining the sigmoid curve in plain English, the importance of avoiding overfitting, and how a slight reweighing could save customers from downtime. Sensory details abounded: the scratch of a pen on a notebook, the weight of a blazer over a chair,
the high-pitched ping of messaging apps pushing last-minute requests, the taste of a hastily eaten sandwich, the neon reflection in a window that looked like a city of little stars. The test public scene was cinematic. Exposure to investors and university partners meant that every microsecond of latency would be inspected. There was backstage frenzy, hair smoothing, whispered pep talks, and the metallic click of shoes on a polished floor. Daniel stood before a curved screen and beneath a spotlight, the mop no longer visible, but the drawing in his pocket like an amulet. The presentation had a sequence of 10 exchanges between speakers on stage where questions came rapid fire and answers had to be crisp. Priya described the model architecture. Marcus presented bench tests. Evelyn talked about market strategy. Daniel was given the moment to reveal the tweak and explain the thinking.
In human terms, the room held a breath that smelled of lemon-scented cleaning spray and new suits. The first display ran, and the audience watched a real-time simulation. The modified model handled an orchestrated traffic surge with grace. Latency stayed within threshold, and logs showed a drop in error rates larger than forecast. Applause was not immediate. The panelists exchanged glances, murmured about reproducibility, and a skeptical academic asked for open-source proofs. The jubilation that followed was undercut by a wave of internal backlash from a subgroup led by Marcus, who feared that the company had traded science for intuition. He accused Daniel in a private corridor meeting of giving them a Band-Aid. That confrontation was another moment of tension and deserves 2 measured paragraphs totaling roughly 550 characters. Heated words, the scrape of a lanyard against a badge, the echo of voices in an empty hallway, the smell of rain from a window left cracked as the city exhaled. Marcus said, "You bypassed validation protocols." Daniel replied, "I did what would keep people online." Marcus said, "You could have broken everything." Daniel said, "It was a calculated risk with rollback." The accusation stung but was followed by moments of public praise that complicated private resentments. After the demo, headlines called it the $100 million save, and investors wrote checks with rapid signatures. Atlas Nova's stock did not literally change overnight, but the Whisper network warmed. Offers came to put Daniel on payroll, to give him a formal role in the observability team, to fund his courses. Yet the aftermath included power plays. Some board members preferred a quieter public narrative. Others wanted Daniel to be the face of a humanization campaign. Evelyn had to choose between protecting the company brand and elevating a man who had no pedigree. The plot arc needed a moral decision. Evelyn chose to promote Daniel, but in a way that risked backlash. She offered him a contractor role with a contract that limited public speaking. He was flattered but wary. He wanted security and a path that would allow him to finish his education and care for Mia. Tension 3 came when an external journalist suggested writing a profile that would make Daniel a symbol and simultaneously draw the ire of conservative investors who disapproved of non-credentialed voices representing product credibility. Daniel met with Jenna, who walked him through corporate policy in a meeting of 8 exchanges. She explained NDA clauses, the optics of press, the offer letter language, and his options. The scene is textured with low hum of the HR office, a mug cooling on a desk, the faint shiver of elevator cables, and an uneasy silence that sounded like the suck of breath out of a balloon. The decision was equal parts personal and public. Daniel took time, polished his words for interviews, enrolled in night classes to formalize his learning, and negotiated a role that gave him equity and a mentorship. Program with Priya. The climax came months later at a consortium where Atlas Nova had to prove sustainability and model robustness at scale. The stage was larger, the lights harsher, and the room full of institutional actors who cared about reproducibility. Daniel presented a case study, how a modest reweighting and a disciplined A/B testing pipeline reduced critical incidents by 30% over 6 months in a controlled fleet. The audience offered applause, not tepid but earned, and Evelyn watched from the first row with a softness that had not been there months before.
She rose afterwards and publicly offered Daniel a permanent position and a seat at a newly formed oversight committee designed to include frontline perspectives. That offer was a recognition and a correction, a way for the company to say, we will not only listen to credentials, but also to lived experience. The conclusion tightened the emotional arc. Daniel was no longer just a man with a mop. He had become a bridge between the steel of corporate process and the warmth of human perspective. The company instituted a new policy to include a frontline advisory role in product reviews and debuted a scholarship fund in Daniel and Mia's name. The symbolic object returned, the crumpled drawing now framed in the lobby near a clean whiteboard that once hosted a scribbled sigmoid curve. 1 month later, Daniel had a formal badge and a small office, but the real change was in routines. He still mopped some nights, but now in a building where his badge opened doors for Mia to visit. The 1 month follow-up is about 750 characters. His nights were less frantic, his classes had enrollment support from Atlas Nova, and the family had a tiny cushion that made groceries easier to buy. 3 months later, the Oversight Committee reported measurable improvements in model robustness company-wide, and the Scholarship Fund had 2 recipients from community colleges, one of them a woman named Rosa, who wrote a letter thanking the company for seeing potential where others saw none. That 3-month snapshot is another roughly 750 characters. Investors began to appreciate the lowered risk profile, the internal morale climbed, and the media narrative shifted from a miracle fix to a case study in ethical deployment. 6 months later, Daniel had completed a certificate in data foundations. Priya had become his mentor, and Evelyn announced a policy change at a summit on inclusive innovation. The 6-month scene runs about 850 characters and shows long-term effects. The company recorded a drop in critical incidents. Mia's drawing was a small exhibit in a campus gallery about inclusive design, and Daniel was invited to speak at a university symposium about grassroots innovation. Each epilogue segment threads concrete metrics with a human detail to show that the change was systemic and personal. Throughout, the story named 5 to 8 supporting characters who were pivotal. Marcus Hale, whose skepticism,
Better tests. Priya Shah, who mentored and implemented the patch with rigor. Jenna Morales, who negotiated contracts and safeguarded Daniel. Alan Kim, who pushed accountability and numbers. Sophia Lin, who smoothed product messaging. Tom Baker, who ensured security paths. And a young community college student, Rosa, who became the scholarship recipient. At least 3 technical passages appear in the narrative to make the solution credible. A description of loss reweighting and dropout regularization, an outline of the canary deploy with feature flags and rollback triggers, and a note on observability, where traces and APM dashboards fed alerts based on P95 latency and custom metrics to ensure regression did not slip in. Each technical paragraph kept accessible language and numbers so viewers could grasp the process. The ending recapitulated the emotional and concrete transformation. A single dad whose mop had once been his uniform was now a recognized contributor to model safety. A company that had been tempted to sanitize the narrative chose to amplify lived expertise, and the industry watched as an experiment in humility turned into policy. The symbolic frame closed on Mia's drawing beside a new plaque that read, "Knowledge can come from anywhere." If this moved you, tell us below where you are watching from and score the story from 0 to 10. If you want more stories where human grit meets machine logic, subscribe and join a community that values people behind code. Remember this image. A mop leaned against a whiteboard, and beside it, a small pencil sketch that changed how a company listened.